Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We are going to give folks just another minute or so to join. We have quite a few of you on the line. Thank you so much for being here with us today. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Thank you, Stacy. My name is Shara Motati. I am the Chief of Staff for the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office. I always get tripped up on that still. In the Department of Energy, EERE, it's a privilege to be here with you this afternoon to discuss our budget request that we just submitted to Congress as part of the President's budget request a few days ago. Just a few housekeeping items. I have to start with these. This webinar is being recorded, and if you speak during the call or use a video connection, you are presumed to consent to recording and the use of your voice and image, as we may post this webinar on the DOE website or for future use internally. As a logistical note, aside from the panelists here today, participants will not have video or voice functionality. We do want to hear from you, however. The Q&A function is enabled, so please send your questions to us throughout the webinar. We'll have some time at the end dedicated to Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. So let me first briefly introduce our fantastic team, senior team that we have here to talk with you today. We're going to start with Acting Assistant Secretary Kelly Speaks-Bachman, followed by the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Renewable Power, Alejandro Moreno. Then we'll have the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Sustainable Transportation, Michael Barabee, followed by the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency, Ana Maria Garcia. And hopefully, if we have time, our Deputy Assistant Secretary for Operations, Sherry Davenport, will say a few words. And so thanks for spending your afternoon with us. To kick this off, I'm going to turn it over to Acting Assistant Secretary Kelly Speaks-Bachman. Over to you, Kelly.
Thank you, Shara. We're at day 135. It is hard to get all of those syllables in there with the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, but great intro, and thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I see we have a pretty packed house, 853 participants. This is really exciting. Just to start us off, I want to level set us and just address President Biden's ambitious climate strategy. It is laid out really to put America on an irreversible path to achieving a carbon-free power sector by 2035 and a 100% clean energy economy not later than 2050. So in EERE, we really recognize our essential role in executing the president's climate mission. And so our mission in EERE is to drive the research, development, the demonstration, and the deployment of innovative technologies, systems, and practices that will help Americans transition to a 100% clean energy economy, and importantly, ensure that the clean energy economy benefits all Americans. Today, we'll share EERE's priorities and lay out how our fiscal year 22 budget request supports those priorities. So thanks for changing those slides for me. We've long passed the point of testing one approach and budgeting one technology at a time. We took a different approach to budgeting this year in EERE, and we looked at an economy-wide, whole-of-government approach to the climate crisis. The time to address this climate crisis really is now. We don't have a lot of time to waste. And so as we go through our fiscal year 22 request, you will see a strong emphasis on getting technologies that are close to commercialization ready to deploy. And you'll also see continued investment in earlier stage technologies to get them from lab to market. To enable our transition to this clean energy economy, we established 5 programmatic priorities that guide our 22 budget request. They are to decarbonize the electric grid, decarbonize transportation, decarbonize the industrial sector, reduce the carbon footprint of buildings, and lastly, to decarbonize the agricultural sector with a focus on energy water nexus. Each of these priorities, you'll note, focuses on a sector. These 5 are really the major contributors to the country's greenhouse gas profile. Priority 1, it's the fastest and most cost-effective way for us to decarbonize the entire economy if we prioritize the transition to a carbon-free electricity sector. We need to integrate more renewable energy into the grid while ensuring it's reliable, secure, and resilient. We will accelerate deployment of existing resources and prepare to scale up nationwide. Priority 2 is to decarbonize the transportation sector across all modes. So that's air, sea, rail, and road. We'll be accelerating the sale of new light-duty vehicle, electric vehicle sales, minimize the use of critical materials and EV batteries, meet the nation's sustainable aviation fuel needs, and enable commercially viable hydrogen fuel cell long-haul heavy-duty trucks. EERE's third priority is to decarbonize the industrial sector. We're going to improve energy efficiency, we'll electrify industrial processes, we'll use hydrogen to decarbonize industries like steel, and capture and use carbon emissions. The fourth priority is to reduce the carbon footprint of the building stock. We will electrify building end uses that currently use fossil fuels and significantly improve the energy efficiency of buildings and equipment. Our fifth priority is to decarbonize the agricultural sector with a focus on the energy-water nexus. We will design more water and energy efficient irrigation systems and reduce agricultural emissions through the development of biofuels. I want to talk a little bit about our principles as well. So this is going to guide, we have 4 cross-cutting principles that will guide our work, and that is in energy and environmental justice, diversity in STEM, workforce development, and state and local partnerships. We have to build this clean energy economy in a way that's going to benefit all Americans. And we're committed to the Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of the overall benefits of the climate investments that we make go to disadvantaged communities. The success of clean energy industries depends on a diverse STEM workforce. We're going to increase outreach and raise awareness of clean energy job opportunities at minority-serving institutions and ensure that organizations receiving EERE funding are also thinking through diversity and equity in their own work. We're committed to funding workforce training opportunities and collegiate competitions, which are a whole lot of fun, to prepare this clean and future clean energy workforce and to help create millions of good-paying jobs. And finally, we can't accomplish any of our targets without working closely with our state and local partners to accelerate a just and equitable transition. Next slide, please. In office allocations, we prioritized increased funding for technologies with an immediate and clear path to deployment, and that had the potential to contribute to our programmatic priorities. I'll give a high-level overview of the request for each pillar, and then I'll ask our team to move into more of the details. For our sustainable transportation pillar, the fiscal year 22 budget calls for an increase of, of 328 million, or 41% increase for the Vehicle Technologies Office, for the Hydrogen Fuel Cells Office, and for the Bioenergy Technology Fuels Technology Office. In fiscal year 22, the majority of new investments from the Sustainable Transportation Offices are directly on deployments or demonstrations of technologies to show viable pathways for our major 2030 commercial activity and a 2035 large-scale transition to this new technologies. With an expected fleet turnover, we'll have a full decarbonization by 2050. Our investments on R&D are to achieve the cost targets on batteries, hydrogen, fuel cells, and biofuels to support market pull without additional major government subsidies. For renewable power, the budget calls for an increase of 306 million, or 47%, for the solar, wind, water power, and geothermal offices. The bulk of the renewable power efforts have really shifted to align with the president's goal of achieving a fully decarbonized power sector by 2035, focusing on technologies that have that viable path to commercial readiness by 2030 and full-scale deployment by 2035. This includes a new focus on supporting deployment, greater support for demonstration, and high impact R&D that has that clear deployment and commercialization pathway. For the energy efficiency pillar, this calls for an increase of 1.1 billion for Advanced Manufacturing Office, the Buildings Technology Office, and the Federal Energy Management Programs, and WIP, the Weatherization and Intergovernmental Programs Office. In 22, the majority of these new investments from the EE offices are either for deployment of commercially ready technologies or demonstration of technologies to show viable paths to deployment. Other investments in R&D are really focused on accelerating innovation in those hard to decarbonize industries and strengthening the supply chain for clean energy technologies. The EE pillar also includes cross-cutting programs that support renewable energy deployment, like the State Energy Program and FEMP. In addition, the EE pillar is heavily weighted to the near-term deployments, like weatherization assistance and a major initiative within FEMP that grows the program tenfold. Next slide, please. Thanks. We're using the fiscal year 22 budget process to start a conversation as well about embedding equity and how all of our work has to benefit all Americans through all the way from the research through the deployment processes. We want to create an iterative feedback loop from research to deployment. For example, the solar office is a few years ahead in deployment compared to some of the other offices, and there are a lot of lessons learned that can be applied earlier in the RDD&D process to better incorporate equity considerations. And just to clarify, by equity, we mean a community responsive approach to how we advance workforce development, diversity in STEM, and our energy and environmental justice priorities. We want to provide immediate transitional support in places where it's needed most and build a foundation for community-led transformational fiscal year 23 proposals. We have a few examples of proposed and existing initiatives to illustrate this framework. On environmental and energy justice, there's in the hydrogen space, we're assessing regional impacts of hydrogen and fuel cell technologies like criteria, pollutants, and water to inform our environmental justice goals. In wind, we're conducting research to understand the socioeconomic impacts of wind energy development to develop solutions to promote equity and benefits. EERE, we have Multi-Office Energy Transition Initiative, or ETI, which directly supports clean energy transition in underserved communities through long-term community-driven approaches. On diversity in STEM, we're coordinating workforce training across all of EERE for clean energy technologies, including solar and expansion of successful training models nationwide. We're also working to expand the STEM pipeline and new research partnerships among underutilized minority-serving institutions across the country. In buildings, we will initiate a minority-serving STEM R&D consortium that's focused on next-generation lighting technologies. For workforce development, we have a workforce development sub-program in Advanced Manufacturing Office that supports participants at varying career levels, engages underserved communities, and integrates activities across AMO programs and the partner offices. For vehicles, the Eco Car Mobility Challenge. It's really cool. It's a university student competition, which provides science and technology training for the future advanced automotive workforce. And lastly, in the state and local partnerships, our Clean Energy for Local Governments program will provide competitive awards to support the development and deployment of transformative clean energy programs of qualifying local governments. In our National Community Solar Partnership, this provides technical assistance to businesses, to nonprofit organizations, to state, local, and tribal governments, and will be expanding access to affordable community solar. And so now for the next slide, to go into a little more detail after that overview, I will turn it over to Deputy Assistant Secretary Michael Barabay.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Well, as Kelly said, the transportation pillar is comprised of 3 offices, but I really want to start out by making it clear that we support more than just the transportation priority of those 5 that Kelly mentioned. We have significant activity that I'll touch on that also helps address decarbonizing industrial sectors, agriculture, buildings. And while we are very reliant on the overall objective of achieving 100% clean grid, we believe that large-scale vehicle electrification will also become a significant service to the grid and will help work with that. The goal in the transportation space, as Kelly said, is nothing short of really achieving decarbonization in transportation across all modes. You'll see increased focus across the three offices beyond just on-road vehicles, but including aviation in terms of fuels, off-road vehicles, rail, and maritime as well. To achieve this scope of overall change will require dramatic levels of scaling up of these technologies. And you'll see a very strong focus in that. We are looking for solutions that can be implemented at scale across all of the industry. However, we're not to mistake that, we know that those have to be deployed and activated at a local and community level. So we're looking at large scale activity, but we're also very focused on how do we create the demonstrations and the test cases and the models, if you will, that we can spread building up from the local community level. So I think you'll see an increased focus across our offices this year on that. So three very specific priorities that I'd like to touch on that really embody across all three offices. The first is a focus on demonstration and deployment of the technologies, and to achieve an overall economy-wide greenhouse gas net zero by 2050. In transportation, we are very focused on where we have to be by 2030 and 2035 in order to allow for the fleet turnover to actually achieve that 2050 goal. And to achieve 2030 in many of the industries, we have to be very focused on the actions that need to be put in place right now. So demonstration and deployment of technologies are going to be a critical path. There's going to be a big focus on EV community partner demonstration programs. We believe these can provide scalable templates for EV deployment working at the local level. There'll be a strong focus on looking at all communities and underserved communities as part of that. And that's not just urban areas. People sometimes think of EVs as something just in the cities, but thinking about the entire country and rural areas as well. Developing smart charge management will be critically important to help develop services for the grid. Also in the bioenergy area, we'll continue the work we started this past year on scale up to actually demonstrate viable pathways so we can produce large scale sustainable aviation fuels as well as renewable diesel and other low carbon liquid fuels by 2030. The super truck funding effort, which focuses on achieving net zero across both medium and heavy duty trucks, is critically important in the hydrogen fuel cell space, as well as we think in battery electrification will also be a focal area. The second big piece I want to touch on, so I talked a lot about demonstrations and deployment. We fully recognize that to achieve the scope of change that we want to get to, that we have to have cost-effective solutions. We can't break the bank, if you will. So we have to achieve the aggressive cost targets that we have laid out. We believe that we are on a strong path to achieving those targets, but we're not there yet. There is more work to be done on batteries, hydrogen, fuel cells, and biofuels. We fully appreciate and recognize that. We want to work very closely with industry across the span of these technologies. In batteries, you'll see a very aggressive push on not just the battery technology, but also the full supply chain as well, to make sure that we have not just cost-effective batteries, but a domestic supply chain backing that up as well. The same is true on biofuels, hydrogen, and fuel cells. And then the last point that I'd like to make is, I talked up front about supporting multiple pillars, just to call out a few in particular. While the hydrogen and fuel cell work has a very substantial role in transportation, we believe it also has a very important role beyond transportation. We believe there's significant opportunities to decarbonize key industrial sectors like steel and ammonia. Also, hydrogen can serve as a very important storage medium and more broadly an enabler for achieving that 100% clean grid. In fact, it could be a key to getting to the very high target levels and interacting with renewable resources. In the same way, the work we do on biofuels, while we're focused on actual biofuels that can be used in transportation, in aviation in particular, we also recognize that a significant amount of the petroleum we use today makes not just fuels, but also is making key chemical products, things that go into plastics, for example. We're also focused on opportunities to use renewable biofuels to achieve low greenhouse gas levels, reducing those key areas to help decarbonize key industrial chemical sectors as well. And then lastly, even though agriculture is not the prime focus of the Department of Energy, we have important work that we coordinate with USDA through our bioenergy program that can help address things like soil carbon management and help address the overall greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector. So overall, this is an aggressive budget, but we believe it meets the moment, it meets the challenge that Kelly laid out. I want to reiterate that the focus here is, while a lot on technology, it is equally on how we implement that technology at the community level, at the state level, and how we work to help develop better mobility options, affordable options for all communities, especially communities that maybe have been left behind in the transportation space in the past. So with that, I am going to pass it on to, I believe, Alejandro.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks, Kelly. I don't know if folks can see me yet.
Alejandro, we can hear you. We can't see you yet, but I think you should go ahead and get started.
Okay, my video is on. I think it's just a matter of pinning me, but I'll go ahead and get started. You see here, I'll talk to renewable power, which is the solar, wind, water, and geothermal offices. Like what Michael said for transportation, renewables really does hit on many of the different priorities, and in some ways underpins all of the EERE key priorities. Of course, increased renewable generation is a key driver for a transition to a fully decarbonized power sector. And a clean power sector in turn is what enables the major load centers, whether buildings, industry, or transportation, to decarbonize via electrification. But in addition to that, renewables can be an important energy source for heat, for industrial processes to directly decarbonize buildings and industry, and renewable power can help decarbonize agriculture, especially through investments in water systems, through our hydro program, and in off-grid power applications. As you heard from Kelly at the beginning, the total FY22 budget proposal for renewable power is $951,765,000. It's an increase of just over $305 million over 21 enacted levels. As you see here, the largest proposed increases come in wind and solar power, which really acknowledges the critical role that both technologies will have to play if we're going to reach the administration's goal of a fully decarbonized power sector by 2035. And really, this is because while both technologies have seen substantial cost reductions over the last decade, both require substantially more investment to be fully cost competitive nationwide. And this includes investment both to address some of the challenges to widespread deployment of the existing technologies, as well as to accelerate cost reduction to become the least cost option for bulk power. In addition to that, for solar, rooftop or community solar really has the potential to provide direct access to renewable energy that's operated, controlled by local communities and households, and can also increase the resilience of the power system. You also see smaller but still meaningful increases in water power and geothermal, recognizing the role that both hydropower and geothermal play as potentially, and in the case of hydro, realized very valuable source of flexible baseload and highly dispatchable flexible power. This is critical, but recognizing that the operating characteristics, for example, of hydropower are likely to change substantially as net load patterns are driven increasingly by wind and solar generation instead of just by traditional diurnal load patterns. Also recognizing that pump storage is the least cost option for most large long duration storage applications that are really critical for continued reliability and resilience on the power system. And recognizing marine energy, along with hydropower, are critical for many different remote applications. And geothermal is, as well on a distributed level, an important source of distributed heat that can replace fossil fuels in individual communities. So like you heard from transportation, I'll talk about a couple key priorities and themes that really cut across all of the work we do on renewable power, and some examples of types of projects. And so the first is accelerating the deployment and utilization of existing technologies, and specifically making sure we understand at the scale that we're talking about for a fully decarbonized grid, how to build, site, and operate projects to minimize any negative environmental impacts, to make sure they're compatible with existing uses of land, of water, of airspace, to be developed in a way that benefits local communities, and also to be incorporated fully and accurately into power system planning, operations, and regulations. I want to talk about that last part for a minute, because it's an area where you're likely to see more and more work from us, particularly that cuts across offices. For example, providing analysis and support to utilities or regulators or state and local governments in planning and operating high renewable power systems, and recognizing that these are really system level challenges that have to be tackled at a system level, not from the perspective of a single technology. Also, really big focus, as you heard from Kelly, on ensuring that our technologies provide equitable benefits and are accessible to low-income communities in particular. You see here one way we can do this in solar is to establish a national platform to manage the enrollment, use, monitoring of solar, particularly in low-income communities. Also continuing and bulking up our environmental research on wind and solar as well. Moving over to the right, just go to the right there, you'll see some of the R&D work that we continue to build up and expand. We just announced a solar cost goal of 2 cents a kilowatt hour by 2030, as well as a deployment goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by the same date. And reaching these goals is essential to getting to a 100% clean power system that's truly cost effective, and they won't happen without additional R&D. Whether it's making wind towers taller and lighter so they can reach greater wind speeds at higher altitudes, developing offshore wind platforms that are critical to get access to floating offshore wind resource, which is the bulk of the resource and all of the offshore wind resource on the West Coast, increasing the efficiency and durability of PV, making enhanced geothermal a reality, for example. Also, some of the work to demonstrate new geothermal drilling technologies, and in particular to encourage better collaboration and eventually engaging oil and gas sector in geothermal energy development, given many of the same technologies and skill sets. And going farther down, on staying on the right, really focus on grid reliability and recognizing that as we integrate larger and larger amounts of variable renewable resources, power electronic resources, we need to maintain or even improve the reliability and resilience of the power system. We have a lot of opportunities to do that, but it comes both from maximizing the flexibility and the grid services that we get from variable resources, wind and solar, but just as much from making sure we have the flexibility on the power system, whether from dispatchable renewables like hydro and geothermal, or from a range of energy storage technologies, or collaborating with other parts of DOE, other sources of clean generation or load, that we have a system that works, and a system that works in a way that looks quite different from the power system of the past. And you see here an example from the hydro program, but this is another area that really focuses across and brings together all the different pieces of work that we have, all the different programs we have, including the Grid Modernization Initiative, which is across EERE, OE, and broader within DOE effort. And lastly, on the lower left, going clockwise here, Renewable Power is working with the rest of EERE to leverage DOE's, our convening power and our resources to ensure that the transition to a green economy drives the creation of good, stable jobs, whether it's through workforce training and certification, whether it's through enhanced focus on STEM, engaging colleges and in collegiate competitions, a big focus on innovation incubation, and ensuring that that is reaches a much broader range of communities than perhaps we have in the past. So those are the four big areas. The last thing I want to touch on, as you heard both from Kelly and from Michael, that equity in the energy system and the power system and environmental justice is imbued in everything that we're planning going forward, whether it's new projects that are specifically focused on addressing inequities in energy delivery, like you heard from rooftop solar, for example, or it's mainstreaming equity considerations in all the work we do, making sure that we engage with communities, particularly historically disadvantaged communities, in the design and siting of projects, recognizing that if we're developing renewable projects that don't benefit the local communities, they're not likely to be accepted by those communities, and that's not necessarily the future that we want. And so I will leave it at that. It's parallel to what Michael said. This is an ambitious agenda, but it's one that we are very confident is absolutely necessary if we are going to reach the administration's goals, predominantly on the power system for renewable power, but ultimately that is what unlocks the net zero energy system of 2050. So I'll leave it there. And with that back, I'll turn it over to Ana Maria Garcia, who's our Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency.
Thanks, Alejandro. Appreciate that. And so I will be covering the Energy Efficiency Office within the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and we are focused on the resilience of homes and buildings and strengthening the U.S. manufacturing industry in terms of competitiveness. And the FY22 budget request for the energy efficiency programs in the EERE provides for increased focus in 3 key priority areas: reducing the carbon footprint of the nation's building stock, decarbonizing industry, and decarbonizing the electricity grid. DOE's energy efficiency programs will ensure that the investments that we make in this sector provide benefits and create jobs in disadvantaged communities and communities in transition as we deliver on EERE's 5 key priorities, as you've heard from the other folks that have talked today, Kelly and Michael and Alejandro, very focused on that. And in the chart here, you can see the 4 offices: Advanced Manufacturing, Federal Energy Management Program, Building Technologies, and Weatherization of Governmental Programs. And the very increased focus we have in each of these offices in terms of not just R&D, but particularly on deployment and getting technologies on the ground. This request will deliver on the deployment of commercially available technologies and workforce development across the country through partnerships with the federal energy management community, state and local governments, commercial businesses, the home performance industry, and key industries in the manufacturing sector. So you can see here 39% increase in the Advanced Manufacturing Office, an increase of 995% in Federal Energy Management Program, really showing how the federal government can lead in transitioning to a clean energy economy. Building Technologies, a 32% increase, and the Weatherization Intergovernmental Programs Office, 114%. So looking at the details below, the investment proposed in the building sector will advance and lock in energy savings and carbon reductions through building energy codes and appliance standards. We're looking at how we can approach the 125 million US homes and commercial buildings across the country. It's one of our main thrusts to especially put the pedal to the metal on appliance standards and to meet our federal requirements in that regard. And the budget request will also expand opportunities for integrating renewables and man flexibility technologies through expansion of DOE's Connected Communities projects. This has been a very successful initiative in its first iteration, and we see a multitude of benefits and new solution sets coming out of greater and increased focus in this partnership. Another major thrust is the investment that DOE will make in leading by example, as I talked about, with deep retrofits in federal buildings and facilities, reducing the carbon footprint of federal government buildings, saving energy and taxpayer dollars, and creating solution models for others to follow. Increased focus here includes federal fleet electrification and charging stations, technical assistance to transition federal agencies to this carbon-free electricity transition. We'll also, moving over to the reducing energy burden for low-income households. This is a key focus, particularly as we look at how to engage with communities that are disadvantaged and increase their access to technologies. So we will be working with our state and local partners to scale deployment of energy efficiency and renewable energy across the 50 states, DC, and the US territories, leveraging the extensive network of state and local agencies that we are partnering with today to weatherize at least 50,000 low-income homes. That's about a 40% increase from what we have been able to do in the past. And we're also looking with this request to provide resources to address structural and health and safety issues prior to those weatherization retrofits and increase the opportunity for innovative approaches on how weatherization is done in communities and neighborhoods across the country. We're also excited that we are looking in this request to create 2 new competitive programs working with state and local partners. One new initiative will be the launch of a Build Back Better Challenge Grants program. This will support novel clean energy approaches through state and local collaborations. And DOE will work proactively with the state energy offices and local stakeholder groups in developing this initiative. A second new initiative that we are excited about in this request is a joint collaboration between the Building Technology Office and the Weatherization and Environmental Programs Office, providing a new pathways for you to partner directly with local governments. And through these funds, we will provide technical assistance and increase capacity that will facilitate investments in cutting edge technologies and develop a new energy workforce in communities of all kinds across the program. Technical assistance will be a key part of this for all of our partners, but particularly for local governments and those in the disadvantaged communities that will need a little bit more help to be able to access that capacity funding. And then as we look at the work that we're doing in our advanced manufacturing office, one of our focuses there will be to reduce carbon impacts from most energy intensive industries by improving processes and materials, particularly as we focus on steel, cement, and chemical manufacturing. Ensuring key supply chains are available and that we are promoting their increased presence in the United States, and also helping U.S. industries to become more agile, resilient, and responsive, looking at more flexible and connected manufacturing infrastructure that can better weather market disruptions and bring more emerging technologies to scale. As with all of our other programs, the DOE's advanced manufacturing portfolio is also very focused on supporting workforce development activities in this sector. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over for the next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Anna Maria. So just a few more slides and then we'll open up to Q&A. I wanted to show this slide. You can see it's a graph of our appropriations by pillar from fiscal year 2016 up to our request for fiscal year 22. You can see this increase in funding requested for 22 is really indicative of the urgency of what we see as the climate crisis and the goals that President Biden has laid out for us. The funding that we receive in fiscal year 22 will empower us to help accelerate the progress that's critical to securing our clean energy future. And the next slide is really a graph. We can move to the next slide, please. Great. Finally, this graph breaks down our request by pillar and by office. It shows you sort of a snapshot of the entirety of our request. It can be a helpful resource to our stakeholders who have joined us here today. So that's it. Thank you so much to all of you who have joined today's webinar. 1,000 people at some point during this webinar today. And at this time, we're happy to take any questions. Shara, we want to, great.
Thanks, Kelly. And thanks, everyone. So we have a number of questions coming in. Thanks for your participation. And if my colleagues could turn on their videos and also a few of you could lean into your computers to improve the audio, that would be great. We have a question first, that I can answer. When will the budget justifications for EERE be released online? That is a great question. We hope very soon. So EERE's what we call a budget in brief was released last Friday with highlights and the information we shared with you today. We'll have what's called congressional justifications, which actually go initiative by initiative, newly proposed initiatives, and really showing in more detail the change between the 21 enacted numbers and what we proposed in the president's budget this year. The next question is for Alejandro. There's a number of questions, so Alejandro, if we could start with you. Will EERE be involved in initiatives to address energy reliability?
Yes, I think the majority of what we do one way or another addresses energy reliability. If we think towards likely build outs of the power system that meet the president's 2035 goals of a fully decarbonized power system, it doesn't work if it's not reliable, if we don't maintain or really improve the reliability criteria we have. So everything we do has to drive not only to cost effectiveness, not only to decarbonization, but to maintaining and improving reliability from a system level. So certainly some of our work is specifically and uniquely positioned to look at reliability issues, but it's incorporated in all the work inherently that we do.
Thank you. Alejandro, there's a few more questions for you, if you don't mind. I'll run through these and then we can turn it to Michael for some transportation related questions. So the next question is, can you speak a little bit more to how EERE plans to invest research dollars into the wind energy technology office, particularly with regard to offshore wind? And then if you could also speak a little bit more about the, let's start with that question on WE2 and offshore wind.
I think offshore wind is a really nice encapsulation of the priorities and the themes that I mentioned. They're all relevant. You of course need cost reduction, and really we need to be able to develop floating offshore wind platforms that don't exist right now in order to be able to reach the scale of deployment that we're talking about, even by the 2030 goal, if not beyond. At the same time, there has to be a big focus on deployment. We saw what happened with Cape Wind. If it takes 10 years for the next even shallow water offshore wind project to be deployed, we're not going to meet the president's targets. And that involves working really closely with communities, not only understanding the environmental impacts, but ensuring that projects are developed, designed, operated in a way that provides local benefit to those communities. Communities want them. And lastly, offshore wind and siting large amounts of power generation offshore is something we haven't done before. And that implies both operation and hardware for the variability to its increased amount of variable renewables, but also potentially new transmission connections that are offshore. And so it really brings everything together. And the manufacturing, of course, it's a great opportunity for coastal communities to benefit both from the siting and from the manufacturing and the shipping that comes with offshore wind. So
great, thank you. Another question for you, Alejandro. Can you provide any insight on future funding opportunities for local governments out of this requested budget, and what funding opportunities might be available for local governments in the future? Perhaps if Alejandro wanted to start, and then Kelly or others, if you'd like to add.
Sure. Obviously, we can't talk about specific funding opportunities going forward, but you heard from me and you heard from a lot of us the importance of engagement and working closely with local government partners. And again, this hits right at the heart of what I was talking about designing projects that meet local needs. Ultimately, the decisions that drive our industries are going to be made at a state level and at a local level, working both with local governments who often set the most ambitious clean energy targets that we have in the country, and also working with local communities as well, not only the governments, but community leaders, and making sure that we're working with different aspects of a community, different communities within a city as we move forward. And so not only working with local governments, but using DOE's resources and our convening power to bring together local governments, state governments, utilities, and communities. That's essential to I think, from all of our perspective on achieving the goals that we have at a national level.
I think Alejandro said it very well. And the only thing that I might add is that it's really incredibly important that we get that input from the local communities and from the state governments and local governments in order to develop a funding opportunity that will be equitable and that will be impactful. And so I think, even though we wouldn't normally, even if we had this planned out in terms of exactly what the funding opportunities were, that would be the wrong approach. We really want to go into the communities first, find out what it is that you all are needing and how we can support that. And our funding opportunities come from that. We have some ideas, but we really want to make sure that it's connecting well.
Great, thank you. Michael, a few transportation questions for you. So the first one, there's a significant interest in a rapid increase in electric vehicle deployment in this country. Do we have enough raw materials to actually achieve the vision that we have in mind? And what might be needed to secure the supply chain?
Well, the answer is that we can have enough raw materials, although do we have them today immediately in the processing? No. So that will be an important part of what we focus on in terms of building up the both the processing capability as well as the actual access to those raw materials, whether they be domestically or not. We think there's a lot that can be done here. And it's an important part as we think about jobs and workforce as well. There's a significant growth we see, not just in the making of battery cells, but in all the upstream materials from them. So that will definitely be part of what we're focusing on.
Thank you. Where do you see, another question that's come in on biomass, where do you see biomass fitting into the renewable sort of scope of work?
Well, within the transportation sector, there are definitely aspects of transportation that are difficult to get to a low greenhouse gas through electrification or through hydrogen, aviation being kind of the most obvious and direct. So we see, but not the only one by any stretch. So we see that biofuels, whether they're coming from waste carbon resources like municipal solid waste or biosolids, or from residual crops, that they will have a substantial role in developing sustainable aviation fuels. In fact, we see that there's the potential that we could have all of the aviation sector met, all of its fuel needs met in the future through sustainable aviation fuels. But those would also be fuels, will also be fuels that will be in the diesel range and the gasoline range as well. Although those sectors maybe have other options for electrification and hydrogen, ultimately the market will kind of decide where the fuel flows, if you will. But our job is going to be really to bring the cost down for them.
Great. Alejandro, anything to add on the biomass question, given some of the work your offices do?
No, I think Michael hit it very well. It's particularly one of the potential least cost options for reaching a fully decarbonized power sector. Looking at some of the seasonal storage needs that we will have. So it's part of the mix, and we work closely with our office.
And maybe, Shara, I'll add one comment. In this area of biomass and agriculture, we have a lot of experience and expertise here, and we are very sensitive to sustainability concerns, whether that be water use, land use. And so very much want to focus on approaches that address those uses. And in fact, we think that there's great opportunities to help reduce the current greenhouse gas from agriculture through some of the work that we're doing with biofuels. So it's a kind of a common theme across a lot of the things we're doing, taking a holistic approach versus taking a very narrow single technology approach. Yeah.
Great. There actually is another biofuels related question. I'll take the opportunity to ask this one. Does EERE consider biofuels important for both gasoline range and diesel range fuels? So what is EERE's assumption of how what the sort of fraction of light duty and heavy duty vehicle fleets will be fully electrified by 2050 versus using other fuel sources?
The currently 10% of all the gasoline we use, if you think of gasoline, is from renewable biofuels today. We are going to be investing to help reduce the greenhouse gas emission levels of those alcohols and ethanols, working with industry. We think there's a tremendous opportunity to do that. That provides increased opportunity for those current renewable fuels in that range, and that could also extend up to renewable diesel as well. It's hard to say what the actual percent of electrification will be, but when you look at a number of states who have called for light duty vehicles to be 100% electric in 2035, and some OEMs say they aspire to, I think it's pretty clear that there is the potential that by 2050 we'll have very large scale electrification across that light duty sector. So our focus is kind of making sure that we're ready and able to cross a few different futures that could come out.
Great, thank you. I think we might come back to these different sectors, but I'm going to jump over to Ana Maria Garcia on the energy efficiency side. A lot of questions coming in, Ana. Just to start with the nearly 1,000% increase in the budget request for FEMP, the Federal Energy Management Program. Can you explain a little bit more about the what's behind this increase? And yeah, we'd love to hear that.
Sure, happy to do that. As I said earlier, the increased focus in the FEMP program is that we must lean into this in federal government level. We must show that we can lead by example here. And we will be using existing channels. I can't comment right now whether or not this would be more than one FOA, but we are looking at how we work with Department of Defense, General Services Administration, all the other agencies across the government to enable energy efficiency and renewable energy investments to occur. That's the primary focus of this funding. And as I said, we have a lot of existing tools and channels for getting that done, which is our I think the main way that we would be looking towards getting this funding expended and put to good use in the federal building and facilities portfolio.
Great, thank you. And another question on one of the proposals that's within one of your offices, the Build Back Better Challenge grants. If you could give us just remind us briefly of an overview and how the question is, how will they be used to support state and local communities? And how does this proposal align with other funding for more on the improvement side, for example, the Weatherization Assistance Program or other funding from FEMA or HUD?
So I'll take the last part of the question first. We would look at this as just a complement to the other streams of funding that we have, like the Weatherization Assistance Program. We have existing relationships with FEMA and HUD, and we would want to leverage the work that they are doing that can be done with their funding as we look at how to roll out the Build Back Better Challenge grants. That grant program is looked at as a race to the top sort of model, so that we can get the best opportunities out across the country. We'll certainly work with our state and local counterparts in terms of how we think about what we need to target with these grants and how to design the program. So I think what we'll find is that we will get a lot of input from our state and local peers and take that into account as we put this forward so that it can benefit our communities across the country. It can get at the key focus on disadvantaged communities and communities in transition, but it can also demonstrate a wide variety of technologies. And of course, we'll work across the EERE offices to make sure that we are involving the best sets of commercially available technologies that are out there for these communities to take advantage of.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. Again, we only have 5 minutes left, so we're receiving a lot of questions. I want to make sure that Sherry Davenport, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Operations, has a chance to weigh in on some of these. Sherry, are you on the line?
Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Sherry, 2 questions for you. First of all, will there be new FOAs? FOAs is a funding opportunity announcement. Will there be new FOAs that correspond to what we heard today?
So, as you can see, lots of exciting opportunities that are being proposed in the budget. And I think this is the first step of the administration proposing its budget. And with that, we will take a look at ultimately what the final appropriations are when we receive enacted bills to then scale and scope any funding opportunity announcements specific to how Congress receives our request and ultimately enacts legislation for our funding.
Thanks, Sherry. And the next question here for you is, one of our audience is asking, is there any way to offer feedback on what has been proposed in this current budget, or is it set in stone?
So this is the budget that is being presented to Congress from the administration, and is the proposal for fiscal year 22. And Congress will receive it and certainly work with us with any questions that they have as they deliberate on what has been proposed. But I would note that from an engagement perspective and a stakeholder perspective, and I know a number of the other DASs spoke to it as well. When we are executing our programs and activities, it is incredibly important that there is partnership and clear communication with all of our stakeholders and how we are managing our programs. So I think that there is certainly opportunities for dialogue, But this does reflect, the 22 budget request that the administration is moving forward.
Great. Thanks, Sherry. So we have about a minute left. I just want to thank everyone for being here today and for listening to this presentation. The presentation, I believe, will be available on our website, and we'll make sure to send out that information. I just wanted to thank you all for, again, being here. Once the congressional justifications I mentioned earlier will be made public, we will be looking to do more sector-specific deep dive webinars and discussions with the public. So please stay tuned. And this is just the first part of a series of dialogues with you all. So thanks for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.